Timothy sat down on the stone-cobbled ground, his knees grazing sharply against the uneven edges in his already tattered cargo pants. The rusted compass was clutched tightly in his palm, the needle spinning wildly as if the world around him had lost its bearings. He could not blame the needle. The world indeed had gone off its hinges since their arrival. The sea breeze roaring past him from the vast expanse of nothing but dark ocean that spread before him brought along the sickly smell of salt and decay. The sky was streaked purple in the dying sunlight, taking away all hope from Timothy's heart of finding any shelter tonight. That was all his life had been about for the past 365 days. It had been 1 year since, like everyone else in the world, he had been forced to leave his home, to run away from the dark creatures which had suddenly swept around every city like wildfire, killing everyone in their sight. The local news had called them the Hunters. Back then, when television was still operational, and every army of the world had busied themselves in fighting them. But they were undefeatable. They had not just appeared out of nowhere, but were the remnants of a failed experiment, which had been done to design unapologetically emotionless creatures to replace foot soldiers. Instead, they had turned against their creators, the scientists behind the project being the first ones to die. No one knew how they had multiplied themselves to turn into an entire army, and why did they eat humans, or even killed them. But it was all before the world to see. We knew we were doomed. The war had gone on for exactly 3 months before every soldier had died, driving the hunters to seek out innocent civilians. And that was when he had started to run. They had broken into houses and killed everyone in sight, until the only people left were the ones fleeing and hiding. Timothy was one of them. He had no one in the world except for his girlfriend Tracy, and only 2 months ago, he had watched her die at the hands of the hunters when their shelter inside an abandoned cave in the forest had been discovered. The creatures cloaked in darkness were faceless with large nails, their eyes bloodied red. He could not even find the time to mourn because he needed to run, leaving behind the only woman he had ever loved to become their meal. The world had ended for him that day, leaving nothing but instincts of cold-hearted survival. Seeing the ocean before him, he felt as if he had reached the end of Earth. He had nowhere to go after this, no way forward, and going backwards would only meant scraping for food and shelter, with a constant fear of being discovered. Timothy did not know what happened, but suddenly, tears began to fall down his face, floodgates breaking loose. It might have been the scent of salt air triggering memories of Tracy, and how much the two of them enjoyed early morning strolls on the sandy beach, or just pure exhaustion. He did not remember the last time he had eaten peacefully or slept soundlessly. Food was whatever morsels he could grab in the middle of running and hiding, and sleeping was almost always fidgety. He wiped the wetness from his cheeks, sitting down comfortably when his gaze landed on an alcove by a large rock just before the ocean. Despite the fatigue in his muscles, Timothy stood up and walked towards the opening, finding a boat stoked away in the darkness. He scoured the ocean, his eyes well adjusted to the darkness of the night, when he noticed something in the distance, a distant light shining. He quickly fetched his binoculars from the large backpack he always carried and almost squealed with joy as he realized that what it appeared to be was a lighthouse on a not-so-distant island, an abandoned lighthouse. Without wasting another second, Timothy pulled out the boat using the renewed strength of his body carrying it until he was knee-deep in the water. Once he knew the boat might be able to hold its own, he let it go, quickly jumping inside it and taking control of the 2 oars. It was an old-fashioned, simple thing, carved roughly out of wood by hand, but Timothy did not care, as long as it did the job. The lack of a full moon meant the waves were steady as they carried him towards the lighthouse, each mile crossed making his spirits grow higher. Now, all he hoped was for the lighthouse to be empty. Just a few more minutes of oaring took him to his destination, the island around the lighthouse appearing completely deserted. Timothy was careful about not making a single sound and quietly brought the boat on dry ground, finding a similar alcove just by the back of the lighthouse as he had found on the beach. He stoked the boat once again, hiding it from any potential dangers of ruin, and surveyed his surroundings. From the looks of it, it seemed as if the lighthouse would definitely be empty. The path to the lighthouse was slick with rain and moss, making it impossible for Timothy to walk along the wet stones in his heavy boots. Despite that, he pressed on, driven by determination. He took a deep breath and pushed open the rustic gate, the black paint worn off in the face of constant salt air. The place was definitely in a much worse condition than it had looked from afar, the exterior walls streaked with grime. As he entered inside, he thought of calling out to ask if someone was there, but quickly decided against it. Instead, he fetched the revolver he always carried from his jacket pocket and his reliable torch from the other side to avoid any potential danger. With his torch in his mouth, Timothy looked around and released a deep sigh of relief. He finally realized that no one was there. The lighthouse was completely his for the taking, and he could easily use it as his hiding place. It would make things rather impossible in terms of finding food and water, but he would need to manage it one way or the other. But those were the things he could worry about later. Right now, this might be the first time in months when he would be sleeping peacefully for hours, gaining some much-needed rest to rejuvenate. Besides, his backpack contained enough food and water to last him for a week, at least, if he rationed it responsibly. He took off the heavy load of his backpack and placed it on the ground, realizing how the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The floor was littered with sea sand and debris. Timothy's eyes fell on the lone fireplace. To his surprise, the top of the stone structure stocked with a large supply of wood. He walked closer, realizing that some of the wood was wet, but he carefully used his torch to find logs which were still dry. Once he had enough wood, he threw it all in the fireplace and lit it up using the matchbox he found on the hearth. It was evident that someone had lived here until recently, perhaps up until a few months ago. But where were they now? Could something have happened to them? As the fire crackled, illuminating the place in its warm glow, Timothy forgot all about his worries. He felt happier than he had felt in days, finally warm and safe. Cleaning up the floor before the fire, he spread out his sleeping bag and other supplies, leaving them there while he stood up to continue his exploration. He was not dumb enough to go to sleep without checking the entirety of the premises, hashing out anything that would go unnoticed. This past year had taught him to always keep his eyes open and always be ready to attack. He took his revolver and his torch, ascending the narrow spiral staircase of the lighthouse, which led to a much smaller room with controls spread all around it. The lighthouse control room. He looked around, noticing how everything was still in working condition. It took him a few minutes to understand the controls, all of it being extremely basic for someone like him, who had been a well-paid and fancy software engineer in a multi-million-dollar firm when things had still been normal. He found the switch which illuminated the main light at the top of the lighthouse, the very light which had shown him the existence of this building in the first place, and quickly turned it off. If the light had guided him here, It could very well guide some other lonely wandered here as well. Or it might bring the hunters in search of food. He could not risk any of it. Relief flooded him as soon as the lights turned out, their warm glow on the surface of the dark sea disappearing entirely. He backed away from the controls, realizing that just by the side table, there was something else too. A journal. He picked it up hesitantly, noticing the yellowed pages which seemed brittle in his hands. The vintage-looking diary was lying beside a dead lantern, the lamp needing oil, which would definitely not be available in this place. His fingers trembled lightly as he opened the journal, the first page marked with nothing but a name spelled out in bold letters, the handwriting rather small, but extremely neat. Elias, the lighthouse keeper. Timothy's eyes widened as he realized who the journal belonged to, making him wonder if he would be able to find anything useful in here. He was still curious about where the lighthouse keeper had disappeared suddenly, and if the hunters had been able to reach him here, and this journal might answer all of Timothy's questions, saving him from any potential threats. He opened the first page in his torchlight, quickly reading the heading above. Day 1. Timothy did not know what it was about the nature of these diary entries, but shivers ran down his spine. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the man who had written this might very well be dead, but in the world they were living in, almost everyone had met with this fate after all. Timothy was one of the few lucky ones who had managed to survive up until now, or perhaps he was more unlucky than the rest. Dying was so much easier than surviving in this jungle, and no one knew that better than him. Despite that, he braved it all and continued reading. Day 1. We don't know what is happening. It has been 1 whole month since the radio has been telling us about something called the hunters invading the whole world and the war that has been going on. But now even the radio is silent. We have no source for news. My son, Anthony, has gone to the city today and has taken the only boat we have with him. Until he returns, I am abandoned in the lighthouse, but I am sure he will come back with word. Oh God. Timothy's eyes widened at the mention of Anthony leaving the lighthouse to return to the city taking the only boat with him. It meant that the boat Timothy had found might have never been taken back to the lighthouse, because the chances of Anthony returning alive were slim to none. This meant Elias had been left here, all alone. But where did he go then? Why was he not here anymore? Before Timothy could go on reading further, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on glass, reached him, quickly alerting him to danger. He closed the journal in his hands, freezing in place, while his heart pounded in his chest. The sound came again, growing louder with every second. Timothy looked up, immediately realizing that it was coming from the top of the lighthouse. He noticed the spiral staircase curving upwards and walked noiselessly upstairs, each step heavier than the last. He did not know why he was so scared, because if it was the hunters, he would not even be alive right now. That only meant that whoever was upstairs might not be as dangerous as he was thinking it out to be. He took one final step and reached the top, his gaze landing on a large bird, its wings trapped in the broken glass of the light room. Timothy hesitated, noticing the innocence on the bird's face as it stared at him, its round eyes appearing intelligent. He had zero knowledge of birds and could never have guessed what bird it was, but he was sure he had never seen such a flying creature before. Perhaps it was one of the exotics, migrating to great distances in order to find safety. Timothy stepped forward, carefully freeing the bird's wings, who stared at him for a few more seconds before quickly flying away into the night. He was about to turn around when he noticed a word on the broken window, displayed vividly in the darkness. Beware. Timothy blinked quickly, unsure of what it meant, but without wasting any time, simply stepped down and reached straight downstairs. The loudly crackling fire made him feel warm again, and he sat down on his sleeping bag, throwing open the journal once again. Everything about the lighthouse felt like a mystery to him, especially the disappearance of Elias. He knew it was possible that the old lighthouse keeper might have committed suicide by jumping into the sea after being all alone for months on end. But something in Timothy's heart told him otherwise. Day 5. It has been 5 days since Anthony left. I try to make the radio work every day, but it seems as if every station is dead. No one answers my calls either. I feel alone here. I don't know what to do. Day 23. A ship came today. As I crept closer, I realized there was no captain steering it, but it was only moving along the waves. I climbed aboard and noticed everyone was dead. Their bodies had been torn apart, bloodied limbs everywhere. I do not know what is happening, but I am sure it is the hunters. I fear this is the end. Day 59. I do not think Anthony is alive anymore. Day 82. Almost 3 months have gone by. How long will the food in the cellar last? 1 year? 2 years? How long before they find and kill me as well? How long before I survive this isolation? Timothy's eyes widened as he read the words again. Food in the cellar. It meant that the lighthouse had a cellar with a food supply. If Elias had thought the supply would last 2 years, it meant that some of it might still very well be present. Timothy grabbed his torch once again and ran towards the staircase, noticing that a small trap door on the ground was hidden in the darkness. He opened the trap door and shone light inside, finding a tiny staircase. He carefully treaded downstairs, his eyes widening, when he found the cellar still half filled with food, everything packed in tins. He could not believe his luck. The lighthouse stood under his feet, like a sentinel, its presence unwaveringly concrete. It was a reminder that even in such dark times, there were places one could anchor themselves. He had found his place, and he was not going to let it go. Only a few hours ago, he had been worrying about food, and now the solution was right in front his eyes. Enough food supply to last him 1 whole year, or perhaps even more. He pinched himself, wondering if he had been caught up in a dream, but realized that all of this was real. It seemed as if God had suddenly decided to help him, rewarding him for all the hardships he had to bear in the past few months. He quickly thanked God and came back upstairs, picking up the journal once again. He knew this was going to be his survival guide. He kept on reading. Day 105. I saw lights on the horizon last night. I thought it was yet another empty ship, but when I went to the window, it was just the city burning. It feels as if hell has broken loose. What am I going to do when they come to find me? Day 127. A bird was caught up in the window of the light room today. I had never seen such a bird before. In these strange times, we don't know what we might see. I helped the bird escape, but to my surprise, the window had the words "Beware" written on it. What could that mean? Timothy was shocked. Could all of this just be a coincidence? He had encountered a similar bird and seen the same words written before him. What if this was a sign of danger? He shook his head, forcing all of these thoughts to leave his mind as quickly as possible. He could not let useless overthinking cloud his rational judgment because up until now, he had only survived on pure instinct. Despite finding safety and shelter, he was not going to let go of his flight and fight responses. He only had himself. Day 128. They have found me. I am looking out of the window right now, and they can walk on water. I am watching my death walk towards me, the bird I had helped yesterday flying over their heads. If I had known the bird belonged to them, I would have killed it. I know I cannot fight them, but if you end up reading my diary, beware. Goodbye." Fear ran all over his body as Timothy realized what he had done. He hastily turned the pages in the diary, finding the rest of it empty. He knew Elias had been killed, his body eaten by the hunters. They were growing desperate for food with everyone dying, and Timothy had no doubts that they would come looking for him. He could escape, but where would he go? They were in the city. They were going to find him in the lighthouse. The only option he had was to fight. That was the only thing he could do now. At least Elias's diary had given him time to prepare. He loaded his revolver with bullets and carried everything he owned down to the cellar. The hunters had no ears, so the only way they felt human presence was through their eyes and sense of smell. He had survived for so long and had finally found a place to live. He was not going to let it go so easily. He looked out the window and noticed the first streak of sunlight appear in the sky. With a deep breath, he went to the top room, his binoculars in his hands, and stared out toward the shore. Just as he had expected, they appeared, crossing the ocean one step at a time. Timothy smiled, opening a new page in Elias's diary before him. He quickly scribbled, "Day 1. I am sorry I released the bird, Elias, and I can see them coming. But this time, it is not going to be me. It is going to be them. This is Timothy, the lighthouse keeper." As he watched the hunters approach, he felt strangely calm. He was on high ground and had good shot, and if only he aimed his shots right, he could do more damage to them than they could do to him. After all, they were just flesh and bones too. He had spent 1 year running, but now he finally had something to fight for. The lighthouse was his, and he was going to defend it, not just for himself, but for the memory of Tracy, Elias, Anthony, and anyone who might find their way here.